The ship's biscuit was not bread. It could never be bread once the salt and smoke of the galley oven had finished with it. Hard enough to chip a tooth, pale as parchment, and brittle as a winter twig, it was the closest thing most pirates would ever know to permanence. Sailors spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it pilot's bread or simply hardtack. But on every vessel that sliced through the Caribbean trade lanes between 1715 and 1725, the name that mattered was the one written in the ship's ledger: provisions. The daily ration was a single biscuit, weighing just over 100 grams, and it was meant to hold for months despite salt spray, tropical heat, and the relentless gnawing of insects. Historians have pieced together biscuit production from colonial dockyard records and shipwright testimonies. The dough was mixed at dawn, using flour that had already traveled weeks by cart and longboat from Virginia or New England. Salt was added in generous handfuls, not for flavor but to draw out moisture and slow decay. The dough was then rolled thin, cut into squares, and baked twice. Once to set the crust, a second time to drive out every last drop of water. When done correctly, the interior stayed pale and dry, almost chalky. When done poorly, too wet, too cool, the center turned gray and soft, perfect for mold. Pirates did not choose perfection. They chose survival. The myth of the indestructible biscuit persists in tavern tales and broadsheets. Lasts longer than the ship itself, went the saying. But the ledgers tell a different story. After 3 months at sea, the ration was no longer a single biscuit. It was a biscuit that had been broken in half to ration out the weevils inside. It was a biscuit that had split under the pressure of a sailor's teeth, revealing tunnels lined with tiny white grubs. It was a biscuit that smelled faintly of vinegar, not from fermentation, but from the desperate breath of men who had chewed it for days, sucking moisture from a substance that had long since forgotten what moisture felt like. The process of biscuit making was not an art. It was an arms race against entropy. Ship's cooks were judged not by taste, but by yield. How many biscuits could be baked from a sack of flour before mold or beetles claimed the rest? They used whatever flour they could buy, sometimes cornmeal when wheat ran low, sometimes ground beans or peas, knowing the texture would suffer but the calories would not. The biscuit emerged from the oven as a neutral canvas. No flavor to speak of, no texture beyond a slow dissolve against the tongue. It did not rot, it did not ferment, it simply endured, slowly surrendering to the insects that had been born inside it, long before the first sailor bit down. Yet even in this grim calculus, there were degrees of decay. Some biscuits emerged from the oven slightly underbaked, their centers still soft enough to retain a whisper of moisture. These were the first to surrender, not to mold, not yet, but to the weevil. The small brown beetle, no larger than a grain of rice, could detect moisture from centimeters away. It would land on the biscuit's surface, drill a tiny hole, lay its eggs inside, and depart. Within days, the interior became a nursery. The biscuit was still edible, technically, but the cost was high. Each bite carried the risk of ingesting larvae, a thought that lingered like a shadow long after the meal was gone. And then there were the outliers, the biscuits that seemed less infested than others. These were prized not for flavor, but for the illusion of control they offered. A sailor would break one open, peer into its pale heart, and find only a few scattered holes, the faintest trace of movement. He might eat it slowly, savoring the rare moment when hunger did not taste like compromise. But such biscuits were rare. Most were not just food, they were time capsules of decay, each one a silent witness to the slow unraveling of order on the open sea. The first sign was not the holes, it was the silence. A biscuit that had once crackled under a tooth would suddenly go mute, its surface still smooth, its edges sharp, but yielding nothing back. Sailors called it going dead. The term was borrowed from the cooper's trade, where barrels that no longer held the tang of salt or molasses were said to be dead wood. On a ship, a dead biscuit was the first whisper that the insects had already arrived. Weevils are small beetles no wider than a grain of wheat. Their bodies are polished chestnut brown. They cannot chew through the hard crust, but they can detect moisture where others cannot. A single female could lay up to 200 eggs in the span of a fortnight. The larvae that hatched were blind, legless grubs, white as candle wax. They fed not on the biscuit itself, but on the microscopic spores that drifted in with the flour. Within days, the interior became a network of tunnels, each one lined with silk and frass, the fine sawdust-like excrement that gave off a faint, sour odor. The biscuit was still edible in theory, but the cost was measured in more than calories. Each bite carried the unspoken risk of ingesting a larva, a thought that coiled through the mess like a low-grade fever. Pirates developed a lexicon to track the progression. A biscuit with early guests showed a handful of pinprick holes, each one ringed with a faint halo of discoloration. These were tolerated for a day or two, eaten only by those who believed they could outchew the insects before the insects outgrew them. The next stage was married biscuits, where the holes had begun to cluster, the edges of the tunnels softened by moisture. At this point, the biscuit would be broken into smaller pieces and shaken vigorously, a technique known as christening. The weevils would tumble out like black rain, and the biscuit, now lighter by the weight of a dozen insects, would be eaten with a grim satisfaction. The final stage was full colony. The biscuit would split along its natural fault lines, revealing a pale interior that writhed with movement. At this point, most pirates would discard it without ceremony, though a few would still take a bite, not for nourishment, but for the macabre ritual of seeing how long they could endure the squirming against their tongues. The biscuit that seemed less infested than others was not, in fact, less infested. It was simply the one that had been baked a fraction too dry, or stored in a barrel that had not yet absorbed the moisture from the tropics. These biscuits lasted longer, not because they resisted the insects, but because the insects found them less hospitable. The weevils would land, probe, and move on, leaving behind only a few eggs that never hatched. To a sailor with empty hands and a gnawing stomach, such a biscuit was a small miracle. He would break it open with deliberate slowness, counting the holes like a miner tallying nuggets. If the count stayed below 20, the biscuit might last another week. If it stayed below 5, he might trade a share of his rum ration for it, or barter a favor from the ship's cook in exchange for a promise to help scrub the deck. But the illusion of control was fleeting. Even the driest biscuit was not immune to the next threat, the moth. Unlike the weevil, which targeted the biscuit directly, the moth was a secondary predator. Its larvae did not eat the biscuit, but the silk webbing that the weevil larvae spun as they tunneled. The webbing trapped flour dust and moisture, creating a damp pocket where mold could take hold. A biscuit that had survived the weevils might still surrender to the soft grey-green fur of mildew within days. Pirates called it the ghost because it appeared overnight. A sudden bloom that turned the biscuit's interior to sponge. The first sign was a faint sourness, like old milk left in the sun. The second was the texture. Where once the biscuit had been brittle, it now gave way like wet paper. By then, it was already inedible. Historical records from the trial of pirate Captain Edward Lowe in 1723 include a list of provisions taken aboard his vessel, marked the Rose Pink. Among the entries is a note, 150 biscuits, of which 32 were condemned as unfit for consumption due to weevil and mildew. The word condemned is telling. It did not mean the biscuits were thrown overboard. It meant they were redistributed, not to the crew but to the ship's livestock. Goats and chickens, gassed when available, were fed the condemned biscuits, their digestive systems better equipped to break down the chitin of dead weevils and the fibers of moldy flour. The irony was not lost on the sailors. The same ration that kept them alive was, in its final stages, keeping the animals alive instead. When the last biscuit surrendered to weevils or mildew, rationing stopped. No more ledgers, no more careful tallies, only hunger remained. Pirates turned to what the sea and ship themselves could provide, but not without cost. Rats were first. Ship's rats thrived in dark corners, feeding on the same spoiled stores humans could no longer stomach. They were lean, their ribs visible through patchy fur. To catch one, a man waited until nightfall when the creatures foraged for crumbs. A piece of hard biscuit, even moldy, served as bait. The trap was simple, a weighted bucket, a stick propped just high enough to balance a baited hook. When the rat tugged, the stick fell. The bucket came down. The rat did not. The next morning, The catch was skinned, gutted, and roasted over a lantern flame. The meat was tough, gamey, and flecked with bitterness. But it was meat, and for a man who had chewed salt pork until his jaw ached, a rat was a small triumph. Yet meat alone could not sustain life. The body, denied fat and carbohydrates for weeks, began to cannibalize itself. Skin grew loose, bruises appeared without cause, and wounds that once scabbed now wept yellow fluid. Sailors who had once scoffed at scurvy now felt its warnings: gums swollen, teeth loose, breath sour with decay. The ship's cook, and when one remained, boiled down rat bones for broth, adding whatever green scraps could be scavenged from the bilge: seaweed, wilted cabbage, mouldy onions. The broth was thin, bitter, and flecked with grease. It did not fill the stomach. It only reminded the drinker that the stomach still existed. For those who refused rats, there was leather. The ship's rigging was made of hide, thick, waxed straps that held the masts. When soaked in salt water for days, the leather softened. Pirates cut strips from spare sails or old boots and chewed them raw, spitting out the fibers as they went. The process was slow. The taste was acrid, like old saddle soap mixed with salt. But leather contained collagen, and collagen contained protein. A man could survive on it, though his teeth would wear down and his gums would bleed from constant abrasion. Even the wood of the ship became a resource. Drums of water barrels were scrubbed clean, and the residue of oak tannins that settled at the bottom was boiled into a thin, astringent tea. It tasted of bark and river mud. It did not quench thirst. It only confirmed that thirst was still a force to be reckoned with. Some pirates gnawed on deck planks themselves, scraping splinters from the edges with a knife. The splinters lodged in the gums, causing abscesses that festered in silence. Others soaked strips of sailcloth in seawater, wringing them out and swallowing the damp fibers. The cloth swelled in the stomach, creating a false sense of fullness. It was a trick of the body, a cruel joke played by a system that had forgotten how to be satisfied. The psychological cost was the hardest to measure. Men who had once shared rum stories now fought over scraps. A single mouldy biscuit could become the center of a brawl, with knives drawn and promises of exile if the loser did not yield. Some captains tried to enforce order, but their authority had eroded along with the provisions. The articles of agreement, once sacred, were now scribbled on a scrap of paper that blew away in the first real storm. Without structure, the ship became a floating anarchy. Historical records from the Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's notorious frigate, offer a glimpse of the desperation. In the ship's log dated May 1718, the carpenter noted that the crew has taken to eating rats and the last of the salt horse, and some have resorted to chewing the leather from the main brace. The entry is matter of fact, as if the shift from rationing to scavenging were no more remarkable than a change in the wind. But behind the words lies a truth no log could capture. Men who had once considered themselves civilized were now reduced to the instincts of animals. They ate what they could, when they could, before someone else did. The shift was not just dietary, it was moral. A man who had eaten rat meat once would not hesitate to do it again. The taboo had been broken. The last remnants of civility dissolved in the bilge water. When the next port finally appeared on the horizon, many pirates disembarked with one thought in mind: to spend every coin they had on food, any food, before the hunger returned. The romantic image of the pirate as a swashbuckling gourmand, feasting on spiced rum and roasted mutton while singing sea shanties, persists in tavern tales and Hollywood films. Yet historical records reveal a far grimmer reality. Chronic malnutrition was not an exception. It was the default state of life aboard most pirate vessels during the Golden Age. The most immediate consequence was scurvy. According to contemporary medical descriptions, the disease began with swollen, spongy gums that bled at the slightest touch. Teeth loosened and fell out without pain. Joints ached so severely that men could not stand watch without leaning against the rail. Subcutaneous hemorrhages appeared as purplish patches beneath the skin, especially on the legs. Without fresh citrus or greens, the body's vitamin C reserves dwindled within 6 weeks. By the 3rd month, sailors struggled to speak clearly, their voices reduced to a rasping whisper. Historical accounts from the trial, wrecked off the coast of Australia in 1622, describe a crew so weakened that they could not man the pumps during a storm. The ship foundered not from battle, but from the cumulative failures of bodies denied essential nutrients. Beyond scurvy, the long-term effects of deficient diets manifested in cognitive decline. Pirates who had once navigated by the stars began losing spatial awareness. Simple arithmetic, dividing plunder, calculating rum rations, became impossible. Trial records from the Court of Admiralty in Port Royal indicate that nearly one-third of piracy prosecutions involved crew members who could no longer follow basic orders or distinguish friend from foe. Some historians now believe this contributed to the sudden collapse of Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge in 1718. The logbook, recovered from the wreck site, shows erratic course changes that suggest navigational confusion rather than enemy action. The psychological toll was equally severe. Survivors of extended voyages often exhibited what contemporary physicians called nostalgia, a malady combining homesickness, depression, and apathy. Men who had once been cheerful and resilient now sat in silence on deck, staring at the horizon for hours. Suicide rates aboard pirate ships were reportedly higher than in any other maritime profession, according to colonial surgeon William Hillary, writing in 1730, "The melancholy that seizes the mind when the body is weak is more fatal than any storm." Historical depositions from former pirates indicate that some deliberately jumped overboard during storms, preferring a quick end to weeks of slow wasting. Yet the most enduring legacy of pirate malnutrition is not physical, it is mythic. The idea that pirates feasted on exotic delicacies persists because it serves a narrative function. It transforms deprivation into romance, starvation into swashbuckling. Modern retellings often emphasize the Jolly Roger as a symbol of reckless abandon, ignoring the fact that many crews were too weak to hoist their own colors. The image of pirates dining on roasted peacock and fine wine in Nassau taverns is a Victorian-era fabrication, invented long after the Golden Age had ended. Historical accounts show that by 1720, the pirate haven in Nassau was less a den of hedonism than a squalid refugee camp for men whose bodies had given out. There is a particular cruelty to this romanticism. It allows us to celebrate the pirate as a rebel, while erasing the reality that most were desperate, starving men clinging to survival. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks like the Whydah confirms that the average pirate's skeleton shows signs of childhood malnutrition, stunted growth, and repeated episodes of famine. Dental records reveal cavities so severe that abscesses would have made chewing painful. The romanticized pirate's diet is a fantasy built on forgetting. It turns history's victims into its heroes without acknowledging the cost. The truth about pirate diets reveals something fundamental about human resilience. Pirates did not eat well because they were adventurers. They ate what they could because they had no choice. The laughter in taverns came from men whose teeth were already rotting. The camaraderie masked the fact that they were all, in some way, starving. When we romanticize their meals, we erase the men who gnawed on leather straps until their gums bled, and who wept silently in the dark corners of the hold because their bodies could no longer remember what it felt like to be full. The golden age of piracy was not a time of excess. It was a time of survival against impossible odds, and survival leaves scars that never fade.